We have been studying Sri Aurobindo's commentary on the first two verses of the Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, and we are approaching the end of the text of the study. But for those who have not been part of the detailed study of the last few months, it is worth it for us to recapitulate some of the most important ideas here. The Brihad Aranyaka Upanishad, Sri Aurobindo points out, is at the same time the most obscure and the most profound of all the Upanishads because the symbolism that it uses is lost to the modern mind. These are mindsets, ways of thinking, ways of viewing the world, which belong to an era in which the rishis saw things, experienced them in an intuitive consciousness, and did not reduce them to logical, rational structures. But they captured truths which are vast, cosmic, all-encompassing in their scope, and articulated them in ways that vastness and that multiplicity of their sense was not lost. In that sense, what they have left us are rich gifts. They become timeless precisely because they catch the essential principles of the cosmic working, and the only difficulty we face today is that we think differently from them. And therefore, there's a struggle to enter into their worldview and their mindset. But to the extent that we are able to do that, we grow. Because they experienced and articulated things at a level of development which is many steps above the current development of the rational mind. And so these texts have a great import, not only for what they reveal in terms of their content and knowledge, but much more for the opportunity they offer for us to grow into a higher power of knowledge and cognition. The first verse of the Brihad Aranyaka describes the cosmic horse. Sri Aurobindo, as we have seen, goes deep into the etymology of the Sanskrit root sounds and words and translates from that perspective and not from the modern mind which reduces language to word associations alone. We have seen in our discussion last time that the origin of language was not that somebody put a label, a sound to a word. Rather, we saw that the human vibration of sound is itself a representation of a higher spiritual creative vibration. Each sound, k, kh, g, gh, ng, k, ch, t, t, p, and all the variations of, in all 50 sounds of the Sanskrit alphabet, have, as we saw last time, first a point of contactual vibration. When you first hear the sound, there's a contact and a vibration it creates. Second, a certain force that is conveyed in that contact. And third, the form that emerges from that contact and the force. Sri Aurobindo himself, as we saw last time, has made detailed study and explained all of these. We will not repeat, but we will refer to that as we proceed in the text. But with this, when he approaches the very first line of the first verse, Ushava Ashvasya Medhyasya Shirah, we see suddenly that Ashva here, the horse, as it is commonly translated, is not merely a symbolic horse, but it represents a certain power which comes from the very root of the sound, Ashva, which means pervading existence and enjoyment, strength, solidity, speed of that pervading existence. And so the rishis used this word to articulate existence and the speed of the movement in existence as it emerges into being from the origin and from the indescribable or even from the non-existent. So the whole universe being manifested emerges from and is formed by this tremendous power, which is the Ashva, the cosmic horse. It brings things into existence. And of that horse, dawn is the head. The sun is his eye, his breath is the wind, his wide open mouth is fire, Agni, the master might universal. And we have seen these in detail. Each of these describes cosmic powers as they work to bring into form what the divine consciousness conceives of. And these are describing degrees and stages of materialization by which this material universe finally is created. Then time is the self of the horse sacrificial, heaven is his back, and the mid-world his belly, earth is his footing. And in all this you see, nowhere is there a description of things of the universe, forms of the universe. They are all powers, forces. So the whole movement of this horse moving to materialize the universe is a movement of cosmic power. But the power now divides its functions, and it is these functions which are described, and the specific characteristics, the scope of the action of the horse from the highest worlds of heaven through the mid-worlds to the earth. Now all of this will become very important when we come to the text which we are now studying, where he describes the beings that the horse carries on his back. And then we saw also in the first verse, the regions are his flanks, the lesser regions their ribs, the seasons his members, the months and the half months are their joints, the days and nights are his standing place, the stars his bones, and the sky is the flesh of his body. And in all this description, we saw how the fundamental realities of world experience are captured in the form of the horse, in the body of the horse. But remember, the body itself is a body of pure force. And it is this force, as it moves into manifestation, that creates all of these rhythms and cycles of unfolding of time and the forms and directions of space. So all of this is still at a very essential level of how the universe comes into being. And then the description of the horse moves to a more vivid image, which seem almost to be ordinary human experience. The strands are the food in his belly, the rivers are his veins, his liver and his lungs are the mountains, herbs and plants are his hairs, the rising is his front and the setting his hinder portion. And we saw that these in fact describe the functions at a cosmic level of how the energies flow. The rivers here are the energies which carry the nourishment, and they are not merely symbolic of the blood flow in us, but they are equally the cosmic energies in the material form of streams, or streams which are also cosmic streams of energies by which entire planets, solar systems and galaxies are sustained. And all of these, step by step, describe eventually the most material part of the physical universe, concretizing gradually as the energies move towards materialization. Then When he stretches himself, then it lightens. When he shakes his frame, then it thunders. When he urines, then it rains. Speech, verily, is the sound of him. We saw here how the basic powers of matter, electricity, vibration, power, are described through this symbolism of the thunder and the lightning, but they are also in their material sense, they are representations of spiritual powers. The power of light revealing knowledge, and the power of vibration of energy, which is the sheer force that comes with the knowledge, pure power. And all of this moves to nourish the cosmos that is thus being born. Speech, vak, is truly his sound. And this we fully appreciated last time when we saw how human speech and all material sound emerges from a divine vibration into the material world. And this is the basis of human language, origin of which is the Deva Bhasha, the language of the gods. In the second verse, the greatest powers of the horse are now described, but in symbolism which is much more difficult to recognize. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born behind him, and its birth was from the other waters. These are the grandeurs that came into being on either side of the horse. And we saw how the etymology here leads us to the deep understanding that this power moves. As it moves, it manifests in the front, and what it has chosen now to not concern itself with fades out behind. And so we have the whole sense of the universe journeying in time, in its journey of unfolding and of evolution. Who leads? It is this divine power that moves ever forward, creating, revealing, unfolding, bringing into manifestation. And immediately at the point where it comes into manifestation, everything has the greatest power. Then as it fades, it loses energy, fades out, falls out of manifestation or fades away and ceases to be in material form, but always remains eternally in the totality of Brahman. And these are the two great powers, the power to draw into manifestation and the power to withdraw from manifestation, which are the grandeurs of this cosmic horse. And now we come to the text which we are presently studying. When the verse describes the four beings that the horse carries on its back, he became higher and bore the gods, Vaja, and bore the Gandharvas, Arvan, and bore the Titans, Ashva, and bore mankind. This we have already started the text where Sri Aurobindo describes two of these names and their deeper meaning, going into the etymology. And two more remain now, which we look at. But the point in Sri Aurobindo's discussion is, although it is the horse which carries these beings on its back, and although it may seem as if the being riding controls the horse, the fact is, it is the horse who bears them on his back, who determines their action, and he charts the course of time that are marked out for him by his own self. He is free and exults in the swiftness of his galloping. We had read this text. So these four beings now we look at from a different standpoint. At the highest are the gods. below them the Gandharvas, below them the Titans, the Asuras, and then finally the human beings. For each of these beings, who largely we can describe as 4 categories of beings that populate the universe, the cosmos, for each of them, the horse expresses a special power, a special quality by which he forms them and their functions in the cosmos. And the name of the horse now describes those qualities. But if we look at these beings and their interrelationship, we find something interesting. They map out the gradations of consciousness in the cosmos. At the highest, they are the gods. They are one with the divine will. They serve the divine will. They act on a cosmic scale. They reveal, and their nature is light, illumination. They live free of ignorance. In the domain below, we find the Gandharvas. They are also largely free, but not entirely free of ignorance. Or rather, they are open to the divine consciousness. But their action is much more narrow. They may choose to act on a cosmic scale in their highest station, but normally they are beings who express enjoyment, harmony, plenitude, beauty, etc. But they do not have any of the distortions or perversions which belong to the domain of ignorance, which is below. And here we see these 2 beings. First, the Asuras, who are characterized by the violence of their egoistic self-assertion. And below that, the ordinary human beings who are weak, petty, incapable, insufficient, but striving with whatever dissatisfaction that they have of themselves and of the world. If you see the scale from top down, it is as if all the divine possibilities are narrowing down, ending up in the human being who is still in the material world the peak of evolution. But if we go from bottom up, we see how the human being progresses in his own evolution, starting from his characteristic of humanness, which we will see shortly is described in the word used for the name of the horse. And that characteristic is that we consume ourselves in our own desire, in our own craving, in our own quest. Although we may enjoy something as we proceed, we consume that which we enjoy and we destroy ourselves in the process of the enjoyment. And the nature of this domain and the human creature is the inevitable binding in self-consumption, leading eventually to death. And this is the domain of death. The Asura is a much larger, more forceful being. His character is might and force and violent struggle, self-will, indisciplined fury, self-indulgence. And even when he has a discipline, and it is a huge, massive discipline, it is always ruled by his ego. So Sri Aurobindo says, they struggle gigantically to impose that egoism on their surroundings. And the horse adapts himself to their needs, becomes full of force and might, and bears up their gigantic struggle, their unceasing effort. And that is why the name of the horse here is Arvan. That is the power of this energy, the force which comes in the struggle of the Asura. And so the word captures this very character of the Asuric energy. But you see how in the human striving, our first effort tends to an Asuric direction. Because we know only ourselves in our success, By egoistic self-assertion, when we overcome our environment, our circumstances, and become greater than our immediate circumstance and their limitation and the fate. And then we say, I am successful. And it is this self-assertion which culminates in the asuric aggrandizement. And eventually that fails because it destroys itself. In the very egoistic self-assertion and imposition on the environment, we destroy our environment and we consume ourselves, destroy ourselves, often in conflict with each other. And that is how the asuras typically destroy themselves. At that point, we realize that the one thing missing in this egoistic self-assertion is the acceptance, the connection with the larger reality of which we are a part. And a new relationship can be established where we recognize ourselves as part of a larger reality with which we need to live in harmony. And although we may rise above to overcome our limited capacity and fate, but still there is a greater truth that we have to enter in harmony with. And this is where we have the characteristic of the Gandharva's life. And the Vahana for the Gandharva is Vajin. And Vajin, we saw in the etymology, the full force, copiousness, strength, and by transition substance and plenty, the sense of wealth and possessions. And all of these characteristics we see in the Gandharva lifestyle, but it is also what the human being tends towards in his ascension above self-interest into a larger collective interest, collective well-being. But still, he is struggling with his limitation of ignorance. He still finds himself inevitably defeated by a larger purpose, a higher will, which always seems to exceed his best understanding. And then there is a last transition where we break out from our ignorant consciousness, that is limited capacity of consciousness, open out to a larger cosmic divine will. And in alignment with that will, we find our highest fulfillment. And this is the domain of the Devas. So we see in this fourfold description not only the population of cosmic beings in their broad distinctions, but also the journey of the human being in his ascent. But for each of these, this cosmic power which creates the universe modulates itself to emphasize that quality of these stages. We will also say from the vocabulary of Sri Aurobindo's own description, the human, and that is the horse that carries us as Ashva, represents our life in the material world. The Asuric is an attempt to rise into the vital, and the Gandharva is the higher vital turning towards the mental and spiritual. The gods represent the higher mind and the spiritual in their domain of rule and the qualities they express. So far in the text, Sri Aurobindo has discussed these two words of Arvan and Vajin. And we now come to Haya and Ashva. Haya for the gods, Ashva for the humans. And here Sri Aurobindo writes, and Haya, in the light of these examples, we can hazard a suggestion. The root meaning is motion. Ha, you will remember, is pure force. If you recall, last time I had mentioned to you this text where Sri Aurobindo describes the root sounds and the nature of the vibration, force and form associated. So Ha is pure force and Ya is the relation. That's the quality that ear brings. And so, haya, the root meaning is motion. And from certain kindred words, hill to swing, hind to swing, hind to roam about freely. And from another sense of he, to exhilarate, to gladden, we may perhaps infer that haya indicated to the sage a swift, free and joyous bounding motion, fit movement for the bearer of the gods. So this is the horse, the form that he takes, the name that he has when he carries the horse, the gods on his back. For the Aryan gods were devas, angels of joy and brightness, fulfilled in being, in harmony with their functions and surroundings, not like the Titans, imperfect, dispossessed, struggling. Firmly seated on the bounding joy of the horse, they deliver themselves confidently to the exaltation of his movements. So this is what he has to say. In the text from which we read last time, where the first rig of the Rig Veda is described, Sri Aurobindo has elaborated on this word deva and the root sense, the roots from which deva comes. And I'd like to read briefly from that. Devam, he says, a god. From the secondary root div, to flash, gleam, vibrate, play. So div has this sense. On the basis of the constant the, of which the gunas are force, heavy violence, density, dense penetration, dense movement, we get da to cut, di to vibrate, and du to trouble. And from di we get div, meaning to vibrate shiningly, gleam, scintillate, or play. I see from here how naturally the word deva fits the description of the domain of the gods. The devas are those who play in light. Their proper home is in the Vijnanam, Maharloka, Karana Jagat, the causal world, where matter is Jyotirmaya, of the nature of light. That's the domain of light, the substance is light. And all things luminous. Sve dhamna, by their own inherent luster, and where life is an ordered leela or play. Therefore, when the Bhagavad speaks of the power of seeing the life of the gods in Swarga, it calls that particular siddhi Deva Kridanu Darshanam. You see, the Bhagavad describes this siddhi of being able to see the gods. Deva Kridanu Darshanam. Deva is the gods, Krida is the play. Anudarshanam, having the vision of. So being able to see the play of the gods in their domain of light. That is the name of the siddhi. Watching the sports of the gods, because all life is to them a sport or leela. So he speaks of how the gods also can live in a lower domain, but still their nature of play and light, their luminous bodies and the worlds of self-existent bliss, free of death and care. So that is the domain of the gods. So here we see how the horse, as he carries the gods, he takes on this character, this quality, and he is bounding in joy and exultation. Swift, free, joyous, and that is the fit motion. The sense here is not so plain and certain as with Vajin and Arvan, but Haya must certainly have been one in character with the Deva in order to be his Vahana. The sense I have given certainly belongs to the word the Deva. Is discoverable in Haya from its roots, and that this brightness and joyousness was the character of the Aryan gods. I think every reader of Veda and Purana must feel and admit. So this is Sri Aurobindo's explanation without going too much into the etymology in this text. But we see how the cosmic horse, as it carries the Deva, it plays in light, joyously bounding, and there is the rhythm of the divine working as the Devas act to manifest in the cosmos. In contrast, we have the God taking on the form which would be characteristic of the Gandharvas, where it expresses for the angels of joy, ease, art, beauty, pleasure. There the horse becomes full of ease and plenty and supports these qualities as the Vajin. And now Arvan for the Asuras, and now finally we come to Haya. And now we come finally to Ashva. Last of all, the horse becomes Ashva for men. But he is not Ashva for all. Why particularly for men? The answer is that the Rishi is already moving forward in thought to the idea of Ashanaya Mrityu, with which he opens the second Brahmana of the Upanishad. So the next verse immediately deals with this character of the material world, the death which is the hunger of the material world. So I'm just reading briefly the first few lines of that verse so that we get a sense of it, because Sri Aurobindo refers to this here. So the next verse to which this is now pointing, the verse goes like this in the translation: formerly there was nothing here. This is the emptiness. This was concealed by death, by hunger, for it is hunger that is death. Ashanaya hi mrityu, that is the verse. That created mind, and he said, let me have substance. He moved about working, and as he worked, the waters were born. And so the verse continues. But you see here, the next verse deals with this condition of human life, which is characterized by the hunger that is death. Ashanaya mrityu. And Ashana is this hunger. Ashana is the hunger which is characteristic of death, mrityu. And the Ashana is in the root of the same origin as Ashva. So we see this connection which Sri Aurobindo is pointing to, and this is the reason why the cosmic horse is Ashva for men. Man, first and supreme type of terrestrial creatures, is most of all subject to this mystery of wasting and death, which the Titans bear with difficulty, and the gods and Gandharvas entirely overcome. For in man, that characteristic of enjoyment, which by enjoying devours and wastes both its object and itself, is especially developed. And he bears that consequent pressure of Ashanaya Mrityu, which can only lighten and disappear when we rise upward in the scale of being towards Brahman and become truly sons of immortality, Amrutasya Putra. That form of force in matter which is self-destroying because it wastes and preys upon others is humanity's Vahana, carrier, bearing up humanity. That's the form of force. Now you see what he's saying is, on all four levels, it is the same cosmic horse taking a special form of force. In the material domain, this is the character of this force. And we will look at it now from several ways. First, immediately what he has described. The force has this character. When it enjoys, it devours what it enjoys. But at the same time, it also wastes itself, even as it wastes what it enjoys. So consider when we eat food. And this is the character of the human or material substance and material life, everything has to eat something else. But even as it is something else, it is itself being eaten. The eater, while eating, is himself eaten. And this we call the cycle of life. In biology, they teach this as inevitable for life. In fact, modern science defines life in terms of this tendency. But that is not true. Pure life, prana, does not need to consume and eat. In its own world, the domain of prana, life is immortal. It can even hold form immortally. It is only when the life energy enters the domain of matter, it has to struggle against the resistance of matter, experiences opposition, and in the struggle it exhausts itself and lapses back in exhaustion, that it experiences collapse and death. And being in matter, it cannot sustain its immortality because matter eventually withers away and breaks down under its pressure. So the life force must move from one form and create the next form. Therefore, every living creature must give birth to another of its type. Out of its own energy, out of its own substance, it forms another being, which is a copy of itself with some variation. And the life energy withers in the first one, increases in the second one. But the life energy itself remains immortal across the forms. It is only because in the part where it is entangled in matter that the form experiences birth and death. But in order to form itself, in order to even survive, it needs to absorb material because its own material is withering away. So this process of birth and death is taking place not only across forms, but within the form, when the form itself is made up of smaller forms of life. Cells, we call them. Each cell can exist in itself, and that is the first form of life. In the human body or in any animal or complex body, the cells work together in shared relationship, but still the principle applies that the cell has to die, but before it dies, it gives birth to another which takes its place. And so as the cell dies and it is no more usable, it must be thrown out. And so the larger complex body has to throw out material which it cannot use anymore, but it must now replenish by taking new material from outside, which then involves eating and absorbing another life form. Because after all, everything is alive. Even the single cell, as it takes material from outside, must take in something which is at least semi-living. And so there is this whole cycle which is inevitable. But behind that, within that, you notice something more profound. In the very act of reaching out to eat, to absorb, or in the act of reproducing and throwing out a new form, there is an enjoyment associated. So there is an undercurrent inside the form, in the life itself, to enjoy its journey, its growth, its play. But the nature of our enjoyment is consumption. What we enjoy, we have to absorb and consume. But in the act of absorbing and consuming, we ourselves are consumed. How? When you take in the food, for example, you enjoy the food, but the food needs to be digested. In order to digest it, your body has to channel all its energies into processing the food, and in the process destroy itself, consume itself. The digestion process takes all the body's nourishment and energy, concentrates it to transform what it has taken in into material which it can use. And half of what comes out as our waste after digestion is the food, the other half is our own material which was used in the digestion. And so we find, simply to survive and stay as a self-sustaining form, we need to be constantly consuming ourselves even as we consume others. although there is this undercurrent of enjoyment. Similarly, in reproducing ourselves, in throwing out a part of ourselves which becomes now the new form into which our life energy flows, there is a certain joy. But in the process, we expend ourselves, we exhaust. In certain creatures, for example, especially in the lower creatures, the act of procreation is equally an act of death. The creatures, as they procreate, for example, the praying mantis, in the act of procreation, the male has to die. The female bites off its neck, and that completes the procreation. In other insects, in the act of fertilizing the female, the male dies. In the octopus, the female puts out her eggs, attaches them to the stone, and then stands guard over them until they hatch. And this process may take up to 4 years, during which time she does not eat. And only when they hatch, she collapses in exhaustion because she has no more energy left and dies. So we find this very strange connection. Associated with reproduction, there is also death, very closely associated to it. And this is what is the character of the enjoyment in the material domain. And it goes back to the nature of material life, life force as it has bound itself in matter. This then is the key word, the key principle. Why Ashva is the horse, the nature of the force that acts in matter. So I reread this text and you see how much it captures and what fundamental principles it has articulated. Why is he Ashva? Why is he not Ashva for all? Why particularly for men? The answer is that the Rishi is already moving forward in thought to the idea of Ashanaya Mrityu, death that is hunger, hunger that is death, by which he opens the second Brahmana of the Upanishad. Man, first and supreme type of terrestrial creatures, is most of all subject to this mystery of wasting and death, which the Titans bear with difficulty and the gods and Gandharvas entirely overcome. So the Titans also bear this, wasting and death. But because of the tremendous vitality that they bring in, their attempt to assert their immortality by conquering, dominating, suppressing, they seem as if momentarily to overcome. But the Gandharvas, they are immortal beings. The Devas, they are immortal beings. They have entirely overcome this. They never waste. For in man, that characteristic of enjoyment, which by enjoying devours and wastes both its object and itself, is especially developed. And he bears that consequent pressure of Ashanaya Mrityu, hunger that is death, which can only lighten and disappear when we rise upward in the scale of being towards Brahman and become truly sons of immortality. So it's only as we evolve further and break free from this overwhelming tie of ignorance in matter that we can begin to awaken to that possibility of true immortality and live then as true sons of immortality, which the Veda describes us to be. Amritasya putra, amritam, immortal, no death, putra, sons, children of immortality. So the repeated affirmation of the Veda is, we are sons of immortality. And that immortality of Satchidananda is our birthright, because we are born of that, is our deepest truth, and also therefore is our highest potential. This affirmation is repeated in the Veda, and then we see how the whole purpose of human life is really to attain to that in matter, in form. And so it is not surprising that for the purpose of the full adventure of this possibility, we emerge out of the very opposite condition of compulsion to death and consumption. We are born in a material which is itself subject constantly to erosion, decay, and death. Nothing remains permanent, nothing constant in material life. And in that substance we are born, we live by that character, and yet our essence carries with it the potential for the very opposite. And then we become therefore the bridge between this domain of death and the higher domain of immortality, which we must realize and manifest. And that's what makes the journey so extraordinarily difficult and challenging, but also because it is the very opposite which is to be realized, it is a miraculous outcome when the journey is fulfilled. And the highest is bridged with the lowest. So it is to this that Sri Aurobindo points when he says, this can only lighten and disappear when we rise upwards in the scale of being and become truly sons of immortality. That form of force in matter that is self-destroying because it wastes or preys upon others, that form of force is humanity's vahana, the carrier, the horse. We see this working even in the most material processes, in the most dense material processes of matter, where in stone you will find everything wears out. Everything is formed out of something else by the destruction of the other. And then if you go down into what appears to us to be immortal, the atom, we find exactly the same process. Every atom is constantly seizing upon subatomic particles from outside, even as it is expelling subatomic particles from inside. It is only the overall balance of the form which is permanent. The atom does not, at least in certain atoms, we do not see spontaneously the breakdown. They seem to be as if permanent, but yet they are not. The form is permanent, the content is constantly taking in and throwing out. And then even the more complex forms, as we see in uranium, they break down spontaneously. They form and they break down. In the very act of breaking down, they break down things around them. So we find really nowhere in matter any permanence, stability, or immortality. And yet in the human there is this craving to realize that. Finally, now Sri Aurobindo links this with the further part of the discussion, which prepares us for the next verse, where he says, finally there comes a consummation to the parable in which the thought of the Upanishad opens out to that ultimate idea for which the image of the horse is only a pratishtha and a preface. The liberation from ashanaya mrityu. So the whole point of the Upanishad is heading towards this liberation from the hunger that is death. For that, he says, the horse is only pratishtha, a support, a base, and a preface. So it's as if the Upanishad is going to describe the journey of humanity from the domain of death and ignorance to the domain of divine knowledge and immortality. But before it can describe this, it must describe the universe itself in which the journey takes place. How this universe came into being, who formed it and why. How it functions, at least in its essence. And then only the description of the human journey can begin. So the first two verses where the horse, the cosmic horse is described, is the preface. It is setting this context of the human journey, and the pratishtha, the base, the support. A context is placed a full picture of the cosmos provided, culminating in the human being carried by this Vahana Ashva. And the same word is used right at the beginning of the first verse. Ushava Ashvasya Medhyasya Shirah. Dawn is the head of the horse. And the same Ashva now is carrying the human being in the domain of hunger, that is death. So this is the consummation of the parable. Now the real journey begins. Sri Aurobindo now completes this verse, and the last line of this second verse is simply, the sea was his brother and the sea was his birthplace. And here we find the key, the means by which the human being will make this journey. How can one who is a product of hunger, that is death, ever aspire for immortality or even attain it? And the secret is that the power which makes this domain of hunger, that is death, Ashva, the horse, the sea is his brother and the sea is his birthplace. And this is the secret. So Sri Aurobindo now reveals what this means. Of this horse of the worlds who bears up all beings, the sea is the brother and the sea is the birthplace. There can be no doubt of the meaning of this symbol. It is the upper ocean of the Veda, in which it imaged the superior and divine existence. These are the waters of the supra-material causality. From that, this lower ocean of our manifestation derives its waters, its flowing energies, apaha. And from that, when the Vritras are slain and the firmaments opened, it is perpetually replenished. And of that, it is the shadow and the reproduction of its circumstances under the conditions of mental illusion, avidya, mother of limitation and death. This image not only consummates this passage, but opens a door of escape from that which is to follow. So, we will study this in greater detail next time, but for now, briefly, we have to go back to the Vedic imagery. And Sri Aurobindo is drawing heavily on that imagery, and we will see it in detail, in elaboration next time. But simply, it starts with this idea. The Vedic imagery looks at the cosmos as two gigantic oceans. There is the upper ocean of Sat Chit Ananda, which he has described here as the superior and divine existence. These are the waters of supra-material causality. And then there is the lower ocean of ignorance, darkness. But this lower ocean is like a shadow and a reproduction of the higher ocean under the conditions of mental illusion, and it is the mother of limitation and death, and mental illusion, avidya, which is the mother of limitation and death. So upper ocean is a domain of underlying unity. This is what we may call the kingdom of the spirit. The lower ocean is the domain of division, where everything is fragmented. But the very first entry point of division is this power of avidya, which is the mother of limitation and death. Once the division starts, everything becomes limited in capacity, in knowledge, in strength, overwhelmed therefore by the environment and circumstances of the universe. At the same time, when it is entirely overwhelmed, it extinguishes itself and therefore dies. The moment you have division, all the rest follows. And this is the nature of the lower ocean. And in the Vedic symbolism, the human being is journeying from the lower ocean to the upper ocean. That is the nature of the human journey. And everything in the Veda is meant to map out and assist the soul in this journey. But what the text says here, the horse of the worlds, his brother is the upper ocean. His birthplace is the upper ocean. And we ourselves are carried by that horse and formed by Him. Therefore, we are carried secretly by an energy that comes from the upper ocean, that is born of the upper ocean. In a sense, the essence of what we are, that the divine horse puts out to form us, that essence is born from that upper ocean. And this, we may say, is the redeeming principle. Because we are already in essence that, because we are formed by an energy which comes from that and led by the energy which comes from that, therefore, inevitably, we can complete our journey back to that. Deliverance from the dominion of Ashanaya Mrityu is possible because of this circumstance, that this sea of divine being is bandhu, kin, and friend to the horse. Our mortal part is kin to our unlimited and immortal part, because the horse of the world in his essence comes to us from that divine source and partakes of its nature. And from what other except this ocean can the horse of the worlds, who is material yet supramaterial, be said to have derived his being? We, appearing bound, mortal and limited, are manifestations of a free and infinite reality. And from that from which we were born comes friendship and assistance for that which we are, towards making us that which we shall be. From our kindred heavens the love descends always that works to raise up the lower to its brother, the higher. And so the whole last passage, which simply puts it in such cryptic words, the sea was his brother and the sea was his birthplace. And we will see this in Sanskrit for the deeper elaborations and suggestions. Just this one cryptic suggestion prepares us now for the journey and describes the basis on which this journey can be made. To put it simply, because we are already that in our essence, because that is our home, because that is our deepest truth, that is also our highest potential and our highest fulfillment. But the cosmos and the power of the cosmos which has formed us itself has come from there. And therefore, in our environment, in our circumstances, is this secret divine wisdom which constantly carries us, nudges us, pushes us, compels us towards our own higher destiny. This is the nature of what we call life. You will see, life never allows us to remain stuck in one place. The moment we are stuck, a push comes to break us free, sometimes painfully, but always pushing us forward towards a higher and greater potential. Who is this life? What is this life but the Ashva, the cosmic horse working in the domain of matter? But his divine origin is now concealed in the hunger that is death of the material world's appearance. But still, that is there. So there are three very important ideas which are described here. First, our essence being that is also our true nature and our destiny, the immortality and divinity. On the other side, the universe itself being formed by a force that comes from that, is helping us as the universe itself journeys. It is leading us, helping us, carrying us in the whirl of energy that we call life. And third, because we are kindred of that, and because the power in the universe is kindred of that, there is always friendship and assistance which comes from there in the form of the divine love and the divine grace, which acts directly in our lives on each one of us when we call for that help constantly, and helps us to make this impossible journey possible. In the Sanskrit, when we study the words, the word used for brother is bandhu, and we will see what implications it has. There is a bond, a connection, a link which binds, and that is bandhu. The word bandhu, literally bandha, the root comes from binding, tying together, holding. You cannot separate anymore. And the other word, which is the birthplace, is yoni, which is literally a womb, that we are formed out of that. We are that, even in our essence. And therefore comes the phrase of the Vedas, Amritasya Putra, children of immortality, because the womb is that immortality from which we are born. So all of this we will see in elaboration next time. For now we can simply read the translation of this second verse in the last part and meditate on it for a few minutes. Day was the grandeur that was born before the horse as he galloped. The eastern ocean gave it birth. Night was the grandeur that was born behind him, and its birth was from the other waters. These are the grandeurs that came into being on either side of the horse. He became higher and bore the gods, Vaja and bore the Gandharvas, Arvan and bore the Titans, Ashva and bore mankind. The sea was his brother, and the sea was his birthplace.